Hello everyone, I hope you love the new avatar that I found. This is just for a special occasion only, though it will be the avatar of the Facebook group, so if you haven't checked the Facebook group out, please do check it. Now, why have I got this particular avatar? Well, because it looks like Lord Kitchener in his Your Country Needs You poster of World War I, 1914 to 1918. And what's recently coming out that is about the Great War of 1914 to 18? Battlefield 1. This video that I'm responding to is about Battlefield 1 and whether or not it's sexist. So, people, be prepared to see Charming Man 93 lay some history truth bombs on these girls. Take it away.
Welcome to The Now, I'm Ashley Jenkins.
I'm Meg Turney.
And I'm Charming Man 93. Pleased to meet you.
Hopes are high for Battlefield 1 this fall, but some gamers are taking issue with one recent development about its multiplayer.
I'm sorry, but that word gamers should be in inverted commas. These people aren't gamers, these are social justice warriors. We must make it very clear to people that there is a difference. And these are the only people that ever complain about shit to do with the multiplayer that has nothing to do with the multiplayer, really. So please, do continue.
Which will not be adding female playable characters.
Oh, shock horror. Do you want me to call the Wambulance for you? Oh, do you feel oppressed and offended that a multiplayer game, that is also a single player game, is staying true to historical fact and keeping the historical accuracy to some degree of accuracy, that 99% of all soldiers were male, and that this is reflected in the multiplayer because they want to give you a truly historical feel to it, at least within a AAA game. Because there's no women in it. Oh no, sexism. Oh, we're not happy. You know, if there was no men in it, you wouldn't be complaining.
That's certainly not new for the series, as it hasn't had any playable women in multiplayer yet anyway.
Yeah, because how many women actually fight in combat roles in Western militaries? Not many. None of them. At least not yet. Right now, the law is getting passed so that they can. But in all of Battlefield's history, in all the wars that they have, touched upon and used for their stories in their games and the settings, there have been no women, because women aren't usually allowed to be in combat situations unless the situation is dire. And they're just reflecting that, because armies are traditionally, mostly, if not entirely, men. And you don't have an issue with that until you're being put in the draft and they're not being put in multiplayer games, because apparently we have to have women in multiplayer as an option. I don't know why. Who cares? This isn't real people we're talking about. At least the avatars in front of the real people. Who gives a shit? If Rust is allowed to not give you an option, but then again it's randomly assigned, how come that's okay, but not having any female models is apparently sexist? I don't get it. That's ridiculous.
But, why not?
It's Battlefield 1, like you've always had it, but it's time to get angry.
It's so, you know what, never mind.
Yeah, never mind. You have no idea what you're talking about. You have no idea about the history of Battlefield or the history of the wars that they place their games in. You have no idea. The fact that there's no women in the multiplayer is what's bothering you, and not the fact that, I don't know, real women in the world are getting killed in battlefields right now against ISIS. But they're brown Kurdish women, so you don't really care about them.
The internet just gets riled up about things. I'm gonna stay out of it this time.
And that's exactly what you're doing. You're getting riled up about something that makes no sense whatsoever. Just because something isn't in the game that you want to be in, you're getting riled up about, and you have to think of a reason, so you assume sexism, because there's no women. And what stupid question are you going to ask next?
So we do. Of course, there's an argument brewing about whether or not the exclusion makes sense in this game.
Of course it makes sense. It's World War fucking One. In fact, it makes any sense in most wars prior to this new law in America where women are now allowed to fight in combat roles. I don't know if they've done it in Britain yet, but once that's passed, it will make sense, won't it? But in the historical context of this game, women didn't fight. Yes, they were present in the war, behind the scenes, at home where they were doing the factory work, and as nurses, and maybe doing supply runs or helping the troops if they were local. But they never really fought. But we'll get into that in a little while longer.
Now look, we're gonna look at both sides of this. Some are saying that it's an issue of authenticity, that women weren't a major part of World War I combat, so that's why there aren't really any playable women in multiplayer.
However, others are saying multiplayer combat in general isn't all that realistic, so why should it matter?
Yeah, I'm very sure you're going to be looking at both sides with an objective luck. Sure you are. And by the way, multiplayer is still bound by the rules of the game, and it's still a simulation of World War I combat. So again, women would break the immersion of said game. You do realise that, right? Immersion is an important part of any game. If something is wrong in the game that breaks your immersion, that game has a major flaw. I remember clearly buying Total War Attila for the first time, and when I played the prologue and you're playing as the Visigoths, and you look at your levy troops, you notice something's not right. There's women in those levies, and by this point, and in fact loads and loads of years before that, women didn't fight unless it was a siege battle and it was absolutely dire, but that was only in very, very rare circumstances. It broke my immersion because it wasn't historically accurate, and this is a franchise that prides itself on historical accuracy, yet it has women fighting alongside men in units, which never happened unless that particular civilization was in dire straits. But even then, in dire straits, they're not necessarily going to throw away their women, are they? But nonetheless, we must move on. I'm getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, this information comes by way of programmer Amandine Kojit, formerly of DICE, who tweeted about an internal discussion of the company when it came to adding women in the multiplayer.
Now, according to her, the game was originally going to have women in multiplayer, but the decision was later reversed.
Well, really, that's interesting. I still don't understand how not having women in the multiplayer game, or a game in general, is sexist. I mean, there are loads of games where there are no men in it, there are loads of games where there are no humans in it at all, yet nobody says that they're against humans or against men or women in general if there's no humans in it. I don't understand. Or how is it sexist? Especially if it's an historical game. And who are you to dictate what game developers can and cannot make? And besides, I bet they had a very good reason for not including women.
She tweeted, "The original BF1 pitch given on stage was World War I with one caveat. Screw realism, we're adding female soldiers because we're way overdue."
So basically they were going to go against the entire series of the game, which was to be a bit more realistic than Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, and add women in the game because they were women and because they're overdue, even though women played a small role in combat, as I said before. But I still want to save that until later because I don't know where these people are going to go with it. But even then, how is this sexist? They're going against what the gamers want, their audience want, what the Battlefield series is all about, and just adding women for the sake of diversity and equality. What do you mean women are overdue in World War I games and media? The only parts they played were in supportive roles at home, working the jobs that men vacated, and being nurses. And occasionally a combat role in Russia, as I've alluded to before, but again, I want to explain that later. So, continue.
DICE later changed its mind because it wanted to focus on authenticity. However, it came out later that the real reason was that boys wouldn't find women in multiplayer very believable.
Oh, so we're blaming it because most of their audience happens to be men, not boys. Remember, Battlefield is for 15 and above in this country. The ESRB label it as like a 16, 17 plus, whatever they do in America and around here. I forgot what it was. This is not an audience of mostly boys. This will be an audience of mostly men in their late teens to mid-30s, potentially 40s. Because remember, most gamers are actually older men because they grew up in the 80s and maybe the 70s with video games and thus want adult games to play as they have gotten older. It's not an audience of boys. That's the first mistake. So it's clear that this person who is representing DICE hasn't got a fucking clue who they are representing and doesn't know who their target audience actually consists of. And these people want an authentic, realistic experience because we've never had, as far as I can recall, a first-person shooter set in World War I. It's always been World War II or modern warfare or Vietnam, or it could even be in the medieval era. We've had loads of first-person type games set in a medieval fantasy world or even a realistic setting. Never World War I, as far as I know. Usually that's tactics games, it's like strategy games and RPGs, but never first-person shooters, and I think the audience would expect a realistic-ish, authentic experience, which means no female soldiers. She's describing exactly what I said. It would break their immersion because they've learned about World War I and they would think, no, especially since all the footage I've seen so far is in the Western Front and in the Middle East where there were no women fighting in those fronts. But again, it's just basically saying what I said before.
It should be mentioned before we continue that one of the playable characters in the main game is also a woman.
Okay, but we don't know what role she is, unless you're going to tell me what her role is. If she's a woman, what is she? Is she a spy? A lot of women were part of the secret services of both sides, German, British, French, Austro-Hungarian, and their jobs were simple: to find and seek information. Remember, women also served as admin roles and maybe even as entertainment to the troops. So in those environments, a woman who is a spy could be perfectly placed to basically uncover hidden information. Indeed, many women were executed for being spies, innocent or not. There are famous examples of these. But again, I don't know her role, and it's highly unlikely, if they're going for the authentic experience, that she was a soldier. If indeed she is a soldier in the Western Front or against the Ottoman Empire, that is against historical record, and it's going to break their audience's expectations and immersion.
So it is a bit unfair that people are accusing DICE of dropping women from the game altogether.
That is very true. It is unfair to say they're dropping women altogether. It's just from the multiplayer, which, funnily enough, didn't Assassin's Creed have a similar problem with this because they had logistics issues? They couldn't afford to put women into the game. But DICE are looking for more of an authentic, realistic experience because Battlefield multiplayers are a step below Arma and other realistic shooters of that kind. They're just above Call of Duty and Medal of Honor in terms of realistic multiplayer, in terms of their physics and what you have to do in those games. So to just fuck the realism would go against their audience, like I said, and break immersion. I know I'm repeating myself, people, but it is the truth.
That part, not true at all.
But of course, there are some players upset over the fact that you can't choose to play as a woman in the multiplayer. After all, that's an option in Call of Duty. They've had that since Ghosts in 2013, plus Black Ops 3 even let you play as a woman for the main character of the campaign.
Yeah, because you see, it's set in a fictional future. The near future, which they have correctly predicted that women are now going to be fighting alongside men in combat roles in Western armies, or at least the US Army. I don't know if you get to play as a British Army guy like you usually do in Call of Duty, but that's the reason why. They're set in fictional futures, Ghosts and Black Ops 3, so it makes sense. It's a different world from ours. That's okay. We're okay with that because it makes sense. It won't break immersion. And it's a game, so the physics don't apply as well, and they wear like exoskeletons and shit. So really, that's an unfair comparison. This is a World War I game. It's a period piece set in the early 20th century. Different rules apply. Oh, and by the way, just as an aside, people, I was just about to finish the editing of this audio, but then I just realised Call of Duty has had women in their games since, if I can remember, either the first one or the second one. Because in World War II, the Russians had women in combat roles, usually as snipers and in all female units, but in Call of Duty they were with the men. But it doesn't matter, that is historically accurate. These women are wrong. Women have always been in the games. I don't know if you could play them in the multiplayer, I have no idea because I didn't play the multiplayer at the time. But there you go, they are wrong. These are people who aren't gamers trying to tell gamers about their own history, so just putting that out there, people.
Battlefront, another DICE game, also allowed playable female characters in multiplayer.
That's because it's a Star Wars game and it's canon that women fought alongside men in that universe. Again, that is an unfair comparison because that's a sci-fi game, as well as, Black Ops 3 and Ghosts are also technically sci-fi because they're set in the future. But this is a space opera game. This is a Star Wars. You can't compare that to a World War I game. Again, please, try and use games that are set in a familiar period. But like I said, it's impossible because there are no other first-person shooters that I know of that aren't multiplayer battles. There's Verdun, which is a multiplayer game, but it's not a first-person shooting single-player campaign type of game, which I probably should have corrected myself, but there you go. There's another World War I game, but it's just not what gamers in the mainstream necessarily want.
And even taking all of that out of the equation, it's 2016. Just about every game that has any sort of customization has a male or female as its first choice.
Brilliant. The current year is not an argument, it's a fallacy, okay? That is not going to make your argument any more valid because it's 2016. Look, it's obvious that Battlefield doesn't have that kind of customization. In fact, there's hardly any customization in these games. The only customizable options that you have is like your uniform and your weapon and other things like grenades and shit. That's really all there is in these games. And I don't recall Battlefront being particularly customizable anyway. This isn't a space opera in the lieu of Mass Effect or an open world game like Saints Saints Row. This is a battlefield game set in World War One. There's going to be limitations if they want to be authentic. That does not make it sexist.
That being said, the realism and authenticity angle does seem to be important to the developers this time around. It's why we're getting so many interesting gameplay aspects of World War One that makes the game feel so unique.
And they really are sticking with it. YouTube series The Great War, which is a show totally dedicated to World War One, which you should watch, did a special episode just taking apart the game's reveal trailer.
All in all, despite a few little flubs, they found it to be really surprisingly incredibly accurate and authentic.
They have obviously taken a few liberties, like most of the time you'd be stuck in your trench getting shelled quite a few times, but mostly there would be nothing until there was a great push. You'd usually be going out scouting and redigging the trench on sentry duty and stuff. Obviously they're not going to show that, they're just going to show the battles, but that's pretty much it. And if those people think it's pretty authentic and realistic, then I'm going to take your word for it, because I've seen those guys' videos before. So I don't understand why this whole business is sexist. It just isn't. It is a personal design choice. But then again, you have been fairly reasonable so far. You're not the worst people I've ever responded to.
They even congratulated DICE on picking out details that largely go unnoticed about World War One.
Now, the flip side of this argument is that the multiplayer matches require some suspension of disbelief in general. Multiplayer combat in and of itself is pretty unrealistic. I think we can all admit that. So adding female characters doesn't break the illusion in any way.
You'll be very surprised how multiplayer can be very realistic, especially if you've played games like Arma and some of the earlier Battlefield games. The idea that multiplayer is not realistic is kind of silly. Look, yeah, it's probably a bit more individualistic, but if they emphasize a certain way of playing the multiplayer, then it can become a very realistic thing. And again, it's still set in the same setting. Those people who are playing the multiplayer, male or female, because there are women who play Battlefield, they would want an authentic setting to fully immerse themselves with their mates and be a squad, like the PALs of World War One in Britain. That's what they want to recreate. They're putting themselves into the game, more so than in the single player game. So in a sense, it's as realistic as a single player. But the idea that it's not totally realistic, therefore you should have women, is ludicrous. If they want to make it authentic, then women can't be in the combat roles unless you're in the Eastern Front. And I'm going to tell you about this now because it doesn't seem like I'm going to have a good time to tell you about this. So basically, near the end of Russia's involvement in World War One, they left in 1917. Some female battalions were formed because they were desperate to beat the Germans, or revolutionaries as well. I can't quite remember what they were formed for. They were standard all-female battalions, equipped and trained like men, and they weren't very good. They didn't last very long. They were utterly decimated by anyone they came up against and were quickly disbanded. Yes, these women did fight, but remember, this is in a completely different part of the war, and this was by the Russians, who have had a record since then of putting women in combat roles, like I said, in World War II. But in the Western Front, which it seems to be representing, and the Middle Eastern Front, there were no women fighting.
Well, players for the most part accept that multiplayer doesn't reflect the authenticity or believability of any particular game. For instance, in Halo, there's basically no story or reason for one group of Spartans to be fighting another in multiplayer. That's how we started an entire series.
Yes. And the same goes for any Battlefield game. Every time Japan loses on Wake Island, you're basically breaking history. But
again, unfair comparison. Just because you're playing different factions against each other in a weird island doesn't mean, therefore, that people should therefore have women. Again, they want to create a what-if scenario. If one faction fought another faction, they would still want to have the equipment, the types of soldiers of the time period, and see who wins, basically. And that means it has to be authentic, and that means, sadly, women have to be put to the wayside, because again, they didn't fight. It's all about immersion. Multiplayer is still all about immersion. If I have a crap multiplayer, and I'm not immersed in it, I'm not going to play it, am I? And again, I don't see the reason why the women should be put in there. It seems to me the only reason why they should be put in there is that because they're women, and because it's not realistic. When Battlefield prides itself on being a bit more realistic than other shooters when it comes to multiplayer and physics in general. So again, why are you trotting this out?
we just roll with it because, hey, it's multiplayer, and we understand that it has no bearing or basis in the actual events of the game or story.
So by that logic, Total War then should just have women in general, because even the single player campaign, you can change the course of history and become a great empire by peoples who were originally subjugated by the Romans, the Parthians, or any other barbarian race that wasn't conquered by the Romans. You can do that. So does that mean women should be in there? And don't forget, the multiplayer can pit the Romans versus I don't know, for example, Indian tribes or something if you've got a mod, because, hey, it's multiplayer, it's unrealistic, even though the game itself has a realistic engine, which means that the players will be using armies that fight like a Roman army or like an Indian army, and therefore to see the two styles come up against each other would be interesting. And to do that you have to make it authentic, which means women won't be fighting. In that game too, your logic doesn't work.
This is the same from a gameplay perspective too. There's often abilities that are totally missing in multiplayer that we can do in the main game, but they would be kind of game breaking in deathmatch, so we just let them go.
Yes.
Citation needed, please. As far as I know, what you can do in the single player tends to be what you can do in the multiplayer, apart from, say, something like a quick time event, which is kind of impossible unless it's to do with finishing moves or something which can happen in multiplayer games.
So adding female playable characters isn't really that big of a stretch if you're thinking about it that way, especially when you're talking about an online environment with other methods of customization.
No, not every game has customization, right? And who's to say if Battlefield also has customization in this game? There's not an awful lot you can do in regards to World War One, in regards to customization. And again, women still don't really apply even in that scenario. Like I mentioned before, just because it's realistic does not mean, therefore, women. That's not an argument.
But when we're talking about accuracy and authenticity, putting women on the battlefield, no pun intended, well maybe pun intended, was an actual thing that did happen in World War I. So the authenticity angle might not even make that much sense here.
Yes, like I said before, in the Eastern Front, in a country that was fragmenting and falling apart, desperate times calls for desperate measures. And it was only for one part of that little tiny fraction they were still within the war, as they were fighting revolutionaries and Germans and Austro-Hungarians, so they had to put women in, and they were quickly disbanded. And again, it's such a small footnote in the history of the Great War that it's not even relevant. Plus, they did not fight in the Western Front, so that would be going against authenticity. Like I said, in all the things I've seen, I've not seen a single Russian soldier. I've only seen British, American, Ottoman Empire, and maybe even French soldiers, which means there would be no women in those armies or on the battlefield fighting.
A number of world powers incorporated women into their armed forces, including the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and even the US Navy.
Yeah, they may have been part of the army, but that does not mean they were out there fighting. Apart from Russia, the Ottoman Empire didn't put women on the front line, and neither did the US. Remember, these women would serve either as spies, or as admin roles, or as nurses. As I said before, they were not used in combat because they were not seen as expendable. They were far too valuable. They could be used at home to create more weapons and ammunition and to fund the war and to keep things ticking over at home, or they could be used to heal men and to aid doctors and medics behind the front lines, safe from combat. That was their roles, usually. Only in one instance did they actually fight, and it didn't last long at all because they just weren't good enough at the time.
So if you're really going for realism here, guys, maybe those armies should have playable women.
No, because the Ottoman Empire and US armies didn't use women in combat roles, and the Russians only used them once and then disbanded them, so there's no point even putting them in there, especially since by that point they were used as a last resort at the end of their war. So what would be the point in putting them in the game then? Especially since the game so far hasn't shown any Eastern Front battles, unless you count the Middle Eastern Front as the Eastern Front. So it would be stupid. You'd be doing admin roles and little mini games if those women were included. What's the point in that? The spy thing could be interesting, but again, it wouldn't be like James Bond unless they got caught, maybe. Then they'd have to shoot their way out if they have a weapon. Again, as a little update, a lot of women actually pretended to be male in the Russian Empire in order to sign up, and some were actually recruited as women. Indeed, there was a Cossack cavalry regiment that was led by a female colonel, but Cossacks are more irregulars than regular armies, so does it really count?
I would like that. Like, just some of them have. Yeah, anyway, it's good. Regardless of how this game ships, though, and who it does or doesn't include in the multiplayer, this is kind of an issue that keeps popping up in the industry.
Yes, it does, because even though the industry has loads of female protagonists in games right now and has always done in the last 40 years of its existence, the only people who complain about it are not gamers, but social justice warriors and feminists, people from outside the community who don't play games and have only really seen games over the last, 15, 16 years, and so they think that women have only just come into games, even though we have a history, a long and proud history of women in games, be it developers or characters. So they see this and they think there's not enough of them, even though there's loads of them, and they complain, but they don't want to make new characters, they want to change existing ones, which I think you're going to get into, aren't you? That's the issue. It's only brought up by people who know nothing about games.
Nintendo's had to tackle this exact problem when talking about the new Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild.
Prior to E3, there was a heavy speculation based on official Nintendo art and the open world direction of the game that players would have the option for some light customization of Link, including whether or not you want a Link or a Linkette.
No, the whole Linkette thing was social justice warriors demanding that they change the gender of Link into a woman. There was no rumours of customising him into a woman. No, there was nothing of the sort. It was social justice warriors, as I said before, trying to dictate to Nintendo what they wanted in the game that they weren't going to play, of course. Just because a game is open world doesn't mean that you have to have unlimited choice and have different kinds of characters and models to choose from. If you're Batman in an open world Batman game, you don't want to play as a female Batman. You've already got Batgirl for that anyway. You want to play as Bruce Wayne. Or Terry McGinnis, obviously. You wouldn't want to play a female Batman. That wouldn't make sense when you've got Batgirl and loads of others in the family. So why Link? Just because it's his first open world game? Makes no sense.
But since E3, we've learned that won't be the case, and some have taken issue with Nintendo's explanation as to why. So far, their main reasoning behind the decision is that it would mess with the Triforce, since Ganon is male, Link is male, and Zelda is female.
According to them, Link is always going to be the main character of Legend of Zelda, and Link is always going to be male. But whenever they talk about a female main character for Legend of Zelda, they always talk about Sheik or Zelda herself. For some reason, they don't want to entertain the idea of Link being a girl.
Because Zelda is the main female character of the Legend of Zelda games, and Link is the main male character of the Legend of Zelda games. At least they're the protagonists. You don't need to turn Link into a woman. Why? Why? It goes against canon. He is a man, and he should be a man. Because it's Link, and what good would it do? It would do nothing. It wouldn't add to anything. It would just be politics. That's what it would be. It would just be a change for politics. And like they said, it would ruin the Triforce, because it's Ganon, Link, and Zelda. And you can play as Zelda in one game from the 90s for the Sega Mega Drive? Or the Sega disc, it was something like that. I can't remember what it was. You can play as Zelda in that game, if you want to. But even then, she's still a main character, even if you can't necessarily play as her. There's no reason to make Link into a girl. There's no logical reason. It goes against canon, and to change it would just be to please a small minority of people who don't want to play the game anyway. They just want to put their stamp on games to control the industry.
And of course, that's their prerogative. That's their character. They can do whatever they want with it. But it's also the prerogative of players who want to have a say in the look of their avatar.
No, the players don't have a say unless the creators specifically say they have a say. It's not up to us, the consumers, to cry out and demand and force game developers to give us a female Link. You are basing this demand on a small minority of people who won't play the game and don't play games. And if they do play games, they're shitty indie games that their mates made in San Francisco. Most gamers want to play as a Link that is male. They don't want to play as anything else in those games. That's male and female. Why change it? For no other reason other than to placate a small minority of people. Why? That is not demand of gamers. That is the demands of social justice warriors.
According to research published by Syracuse University back in 2014, at least 23% of all men choose women as their avatars in MMOs. Most of them are Jack.
Yeah, why would you want to look at a butt of a dude when you could be looking at a butt of a chick?
I don't know, but the butts of the dudes are pretty great.
Yeah, they play as female avatars, but are they demanding it? That's still a minority of men. So again, your argument is invalid because, like I said before, most people don't necessarily want to play as established characters with their genders changed. They want to keep it exactly as it is, because to change it would be to kowtow to these idiots who want to control the games industry. And by the way, that is sexist what you just did there. Are you trying to say that we should have more female characters just so men can just look at their bums? You do realise that if I wanted to look at an actual bum, I'll just go on Google and look up an actual bum or watch some porn. I don't need it in my games. I'm not that sad. I can't believe you think men are that sad. There may be some guys who are like that, but the vast majority of us are normal human beings that function well in society and don't need cyber butts. Thank you very much.
On the subject of player customization, though, we also have data that gamers are split 50-50 now in terms of gender, so maybe it doesn't hurt developers to give players just an option here or there.
Again, another misleading statistic. Gamers are not split 50-50 now. What that study did was basically put people on buses and public transport, or people who buy the odd game every now and then, and put them together as gamers. Even though they're clearly not gamers, they're just people who play the odd game to pass the time. They're not gamers who will fork out for the next PS4 variant or to build a gaming PC and play loads of different games or a very specific genre of game. They're basically lumping in casuals with the normal gaming audience that actually buys the games. And the casuals tend to be women. Although a lot of them are men as well, but in terms of the hardcore audience that actually makes the gaming industry money, they're mostly men. And these casual gamers aren't even gamers, because like I said, they're not into the subculture, they only buy the odd game, and they only play games to pass the time, and not really to get into the story, or the gameplay, or as a hobby. It's not a hobby to them, it's a time wasting thing. It's just like watching TV when you're bored. It's just like that to them. They're not gamers, so it's not 50-50. It's most likely a 55-45 split in terms of hardcore gamers.
For instance, BioWare just unveiled that the canonical main character of Andromeda is the femme version of the character. You'll be able to choose, of course, just like you had a choice in the Mass Effect trilogy, where Male Shep was the canonical Shepard. He was the one in all the box arts and all that stuff, even though they had that contest for the Femme Shep cover for a thing. Whatever happened to that? Did she end up on a cover? Did she ever get a cover?
No, she lost. And by the way, that's BioWare. They always do this shit for politics. She's only the main canonical character because BioWare are trying to please the SJWs, which will sadly sink their company because they have a lot of angry gamers to please after the mess that was Mass Effect 3. And of course, the heavy agenda pushing that they were doing in Inquisition. Inquisition is Dragon Age, by the way, people. But so what if that is a woman? So what? What does that got to do with anything to do with women in video games, why we should have more of them? She's not the first or 100th woman in a video game. She's like the millionth or something. Who cares?
I don't know. She's like the Chris O'Coulihan.
Oh, she's the reverse. Gotcha.
Got it. She was on the back.
She got the back.
Girl, you on the plastic.
So, are you going to do what the Remain voters did and deny a democratic vote? That's basically what it was. She lost. Don't be bitter.
Of course, no matter how all this shakes out, we know that there will continue to be gamers on both sides of the issue. If DICE insists that authenticity is of the utmost importance, you can really hardly fault him for it, although having women wouldn't make the game inauthentic.
Yes, it would, considering they're basing it wherever British and Americans seem to be fighting, which is in the Middle East and the Western Front, so it would be inauthentic. But then again, it depends on their role, doesn't it? If she's a spy or a nurse or something like that, then that's fine. But if she's in a combat role and she's shooting Germans and Turkish people, then it is inauthentic. And we know why they're putting women in here anyway, because they want to pay lip service, and they want to do this for political reasons, and to basically not be called sexist. That's pretty much why they're in here, isn't it?
But you also can't blame players for wanting more choices because, come on, we love us some customization.
I just want to be a pecky, nurse in the field. Hey guys, who needs a bandage?
You see, this is why people like this lot are clueless. These companies and these YouTube channels that just know nothing about what gamers want and what games are like. Look, just because there's customization doesn't mean it has to be in every game, and just because there's customization, therefore that's what gamers want. Look, gamers want something based on what the game is going to be. Some games don't need customization, and that's okay. I don't think many gamers would want a customizable Tetris or something, would they? Just because there's customizable stuff more so now than there was in the past, doesn't mean that's what all gamers want, and that's what should be in all games because equality.
What do you guys think of Battlefield 1? Yay, feminism! I want to be a nurse! What do you guys think of Battlefield 1 not allowing female playable characters? Leave all sorts of vitriol in the comments down below.
And of course, for future updates on Battlefield 1 and Meg is a nurse, like this video and subscribe to The Know.
I want to have a Kiki beret.
Yay feminism, where it makes you a nurse, the most boring Battlefield role in a video game that could ever be made. That's classic feminism. You know what? Go and make that game. In fact, there is a game like that that's apparently really good. It's called Valiant Hearts. You could just go and buy that game. It's a very small game. It's not a very big game. It could do for more units being sold. So rather than trying to force it into first-person shooters, you could just buy that game instead, people. You can be a nurse in that game. At least I think it's that game. So anyway, people, that's the end of the video. And it's just more social justice creeping into gaming as usual, trying to make a hoo-ha out of nothing just because World War One game doesn't have women in the multiplayer. Whoa! I'm so glad that whoever shot down the whole let's not be authentic, let's just put women in there for politics reasons, did that, because Jesus Christ, the game would have suffered as a result. It really would have, because people wouldn't have played the multiplayer, would they? Because it's forced, people don't like it being forced, and it would have broken their immersion, and among other things, really. So anyway, that's all I've got for today. See you later.